The first lie they teach you is that a mother's love is unconditional. The second is that home is a safe place. I learned the truth about both on a Tuesday afternoon in the suffocating heat of a Houston summer. When I was 9 years old, I learned it when my brother, Tyler, the golden child of our family, took from me the one thing a little girl owns that is truly hers. And when I went to my mother, Nancy, my face streaked with tears. I didn't understand, and a pain that had no name. She didn't wrap me in her arms. She didn't call the police. She didn't even look me in the eye. She just pointed a long manicured finger toward the kitchen sink, piled high with greasy plates from dinner, and said the words that would become the foundation of my life. "Stop lying, Margaret, and do the dishes." In that moment, the world as I knew it fractured. I was not her daughter anymore. I was a liar. My pain was not real. It was an inconvenience. My brother was not a monster. He was her perfect son. And I was the one trying to spoil the beautiful picture of our family. They thought they had silenced me forever. That day, they thought they had buried me alive, under a mountain of chores and shame. They didn't know that buried things can still grow. They didn't know that the quiet broken girl washing dishes with trembling hands was planting the seeds of a reckoning that would take decades to bloom. And when it finally did, it would tear their carefully constructed world down to the studs, leaving them with nothing but the ugly, bitter truth they had refused to see. It all started in a house that looked like a dream from the outside. A tidy, 2-story brick home in a respectable suburb of Houston with a manicured lawn and a porch swing. Frank, my father, had hung the year I was born. My father was a quiet, gentle man, a ghost in his own home, often away on business, leaving the running of the house and its emotional temperature entirely to my mother. Nancy was a woman who worshipped at the altar of appearance. Our home had to be spotless, our clothes perfectly pressed, our smiles bright and unwavering, for the neighbors and for the congregation at our church. Her love was a currency, dispensed as a reward for compliance, and withdrawn as a punishment for any deviation from the script she had written for our lives. And in her script, Tyler was the star. He was 2 years older than me, handsome, charming, and athletic. He was the sun around which our family solar system revolved. His trophies lined the mantelpiece. His report cards were taped to the refrigerator. His every achievement was a source of my mother's vicarious pride. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, bookish moon, existing only to reflect his light. I was the one who was told to be quiet so Tyler could study, the one who had to give up the last piece of meatloaf because Tyler had football practice, the one who was expected to be the silent, appreciative audience for the grand performance of his golden childhood. I didn't mind. Not really. I loved my brother, and I loved my mother. I just wanted them to love me back with the same uncomplicated ferocity. But my love was always seen as a given, a utility, like the water that ran from the taps. His was something to be earned, celebrated and protected at all costs. I see now that the groundwork for my mother's betrayal was laid long before that terrible Tuesday. She had already chosen her side. She had already decided which of her children was worth protecting, and which one was ultimately expendable. The Tuesday it happened was unremarkable, which is perhaps the most monstrous thing about it. It was a day like any other, in the thick, soupy heat of a Houston summer. My father was away on one of his long business trips. My mother was in the living room, on the phone with one of her church friends, her voice a bright, brittle melody of gossip and feigned piety. I was in my room, reading a book, lost in a world of fantasy and adventure, where girls were brave and dragons could be slain. Tyler came into my room, without knocking. He did that a lot. The concept of my privacy was foreign to him, an inconvenience he couldn't be bothered to observe. "Mom said to tell you to come set the table for dinner," he said. But he didn't leave. He just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, watching me with an expression I didn't recognize. It wasn't the teasing annoyance of an older brother. It was something else, something cold and appraising. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. I showed him the cover. He scoffed. "Still reading fairy tales, Maggie? You need to grow up." He walked over to my bed and sat down too close. The smell of his cologne, the one he had just started wearing, was suddenly overwhelming, cloying. I shifted away, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "I like fairy tales," I whispered, my eyes on my book, desperate to retreat back into its pages. "Yeah, well, this isn't a fairy tale," he said, and his hand was on my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. I can't write down the specifics of what he did next. The memory is not a clean narrative. It's a chaotic collage of sensory details that still have the power to stop my breath. The feeling of his weight, pressing me down into my pink chenille bedspread, the scratchy fabric of his jeans against my leg, the sound of my mother's laughter from the living room, a surreal and terrible counterpoint to the silent violation happening just one room away. The way the light from the window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, a moment of strange, detached beauty in the midst of absolute horror. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I froze. I went somewhere else in my head, a small, dark, quiet place where nothing could touch me. It was a skill I had been unknowingly practicing for years, the art of becoming invisible, of disappearing in plain sight. When it was over, he stood up and straightened his shirt, his movements casual, as if he had just finished a chore. He looked down at me, the girl lying broken on the bed, and his face was a blank mask. "Don't tell Mom," he said, his voice a flat, unemotional command. "You'll just upset her." Then he walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my childhood. I lay there for a long time, the world tilted on its axis, the familiar landscape of my bedroom, the posters on the wall, the stuffed animals on my shelf, the scent of my own innocence, had become a foreign and hostile territory. I was a stranger in my own body, a tourist in my own life. The pain was not just physical. It was a deep, psychic wound, a severing. He had not just taken something from me. He had stolen the very idea of safety, the fundamental belief that I was protected, that I was loved. He had taken me, and he had left a ghost in my place. I don't remember how long I lay on that bed, adrift in a sea of shock, and a pain so profound it had no sound. Eventually the haze began to clear, replaced by a desperate childish need for my mother. I needed her to fix this. I needed her to make the world right again. I needed her to look at my shattered pieces and tell me she could put me back together. I stumbled out of my room, my legs unsteady, my body feeling like a fragile, ill-fitting costume. I found her in the kitchen, her back to me, chopping vegetables for dinner with a brisk, efficient rhythm. The familiar rhythmic thud of the knife on the cutting board was the only sound in the room. "Mom," I whispered, my voice a dry, cracking thing. She turned, her expression one of mild annoyance at being interrupted. "Margaret, what is it?" "I told you to set the table." I couldn't form the words. The story was a monstrous, tangled thing in my throat, too big and too ugly to push out. So I just stood there, tears streaming down my face, my small body trembling with the aftershocks of the trauma. She looked at me, at my tear-stained face, at my disheveled state, and her expression did not soften. It hardened. A look of pure, unadulterated exasperation crossed her face. "For heaven's sake, Margaret, what is it now?" she snapped. "Are you crying because you have to do one simple chore?" "Tyler," I managed to choke out, his name a shard of glass in my mouth. He hurt me." I looked at her, my eyes pleading, begging her to see, to understand, to believe me. I was her daughter. I was 9 years old. I was bleeding from a wound. She couldn't see, but surely she could feel it. Her eyes narrowed. She put the knife down with a sharp, definitive clatter. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked towards me. For a fleeting, hopeful second, I thought she was going to hug me. I thought she was going to hold me and tell me everything would be okay. She did not. She stopped a foot in front of me, her body rigid, her face a mask of cold fury. "What did you say?" she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. What lie are you telling now? It's not a lie, I saw. In my room. He what, Margaret? She demanded, her voice rising. Did he tease you? Did he take one of your silly dolls? Whatever it is, I am sure you provoked him. You are always so dramatic, so needy. No, I whispered, shaking my head, the denial a fresh wave of pain. But I couldn't say it. The shame was a physical gag in my mouth, and in my hesitation, she saw confirmation of what she had already decided to believe. She saw a difficult, lying little girl, trying to cause trouble for her perfect, golden son. Her face, which could be so beautiful when she smiled, twisted into a mask of ugly contempt. I have had enough of your stories, Margaret, she said, her voice like ice. Your brother is a good boy. He would never do anything to hurt you, unless you deserve. Now stop this ridiculous nonsense this instant. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin like claws. She spun me around and pointed a long accusatory finger towards the sink. Stop lying and do the dishes, she commanded, her voice a final brutal verdict. And I don't want to hear another word about this. Do you understand me? I stood there, frozen, the world tilting and swaying around me. The smell of onions from the cutting board filled the air, a smell I would associate with betrayal for the rest of my life. She had not just refused to believe me, she had actively chosen not to. She had chosen her son, her perfect illusion, over her daughter's reality. She had looked at my pain and called it a lie. She had looked at my trauma and called it a chore. In that moment, I understood. I was utterly and completely alone. There was no one to save me. There was no safe harbor. My mother was not my protector. She was his. I was a casualty in a war I didn't even know was being fought, and my own mother had just handed the enemy the weapon to finish me off. I turned, a small silent soldier of 9, and I walked to the sink, and as I washed the dishes, my tears falling silently into the soapy water, I realized that my brother had broken my body, but my mother had just shattered my soul. The years that followed, that terrible Tuesday, were a long, slow exercise in suffocation. The official family narrative had been established. I was a liar, a troublemaker, a difficult and dramatic child. Tyler was the innocent, the victim of my malicious fantasy, and my mother, Nancy, was the long-suffering saint, burdened with a daughter she couldn't control. This narrative became the air we breathed in that house, a toxic, invisible gas that poisoned everything. Tyler, emboldened by my mother's unwavering protection, became a king in our home. My fear of him was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my life. He never touched me again in that way, but he didn't have to. He had other, more subtle ways of reminding me of his power. He would accidentally brush against me in the hallway, a casual touch that would send a jolt of ice through my veins. He would corner me in a room and just stand there, smiling a small, secret smile that only the two of us understood. He would use my things, without asking, read my diary, break my possessions, and then tell my mother I had been careless, and she, of course, always believed him. Margaret, you need to take better care of your things, she would scold, her voice full of disappointment. He was untouchable, a golden boy, wrapped in the impenetrable armor of our mother's denial. She polished his trophies, praised his athletic achievements, and boasted about his good grades. To her friends, his every success was a testament to her excellent mothering. My existence, on the other hand, was a constant source of her irritation. My quietness was interpreted as sullenness. My sadness was seen as a manipulative bid for attention. My good grades, my one area of silent rebellion and escape, were barely acknowledged. I learned to live in the margins of our family, to make myself as small and as quiet as possible. I became a ghost in my own home, haunting the hallways, my only goal to move from one room to another without being noticed. The house itself became a landscape of terror. My own bedroom, the scene of the crime, was a place I could no longer find comfort in. I would lie in bed at night, my body rigid, listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hall. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow on the wall, was a potential Sleep was not a refuge. It was a state of vulnerability I feared. The injustice of it all was a constant, bitter pill I was forced to swallow every day. I raised you better. The phrase my mother would use on me for the smallest transgression, a spilled glass of milk, a forgotten chore, was a cruel joke. She had not raised me at all. She had raised him, and she had sacrificed me to do it. She had taught me that my pain was insignificant, my voice was a nuisance, and my truth was a lie. These were the lessons of my childhood. I built a fortress around my heart, a wall of silence and compliance. I learned that showing emotion was a weakness, that asking for help was a provocation. I became an expert at reading the subtle shifts in the emotional weather of our home, at anticipating my mother's moods, at avoiding my brother's gaze. It was an exhausting, soul-crushing performance, but it was the only way I knew how to survive. I was a child living in a war zone, and the only strategy I had was to play dead. The world outside the front door of our Houston home felt like a distant, foreign country, a place where other children had mothers who protected them, homes that were safe. I would watch them from my window, playing in their yards, riding their bikes, and a deep, aching loneliness would settle over me. I was on an island of my family's making, and there was no boat in sight. As I navigated the treacherous landscape of adolescence, the toxic dynamic in our home solidified into a rigid, unchangeable caste system. Tyler was the prince, his reign absolute and unquestioned. I was the scullery maid, my existence tolerated only as long as I remained silent and served my purpose. And my mother, Nancy, was the queen regent, the power behind the throne, enforcing the brutal laws of her son's kingdom. The abuse from Tyler shifted from the physical to the psychological, a more subtle but no less damaging form of torture. He was a master of 1,000 small cruelties. He would accidentally spill a drink on my homework. He would borrow my things and then lose. He would tell his friends embarrassing, untrue stories about me, his voice just loud enough for me to overhear from the next room. Each act was a small reminder of his power, a way of reinforcing the narrative that I was clumsy, forgetful, and pathetic. He delighted in my misery, and my mother was his most enthusiastic audience. She saw his cruelty as normal sibling teasing, my reactions as further proof of my oversensitivity. "Oh, Margaret, you need to learn to take a joke," she would say with a sigh, as if his systematic torment was a form of light-hearted fun. "You're always so serious." My teenage years, a time that for most girls is filled with friendships, first crushes, and a burgeoning sense of self, were for me a period of profound and painful isolation. I was not allowed to have friends over. "Tyler needs his quiet to study," my mother would say, even when he was out with his own friends. I was not allowed to go to school dances or football games. "It's not safe for a girl like you to be out at night," she would warn, the implication clear. A girl like me, a liar, a troublemaker, could not be trusted. My life was a monotonous cycle of school, chores and homework, all performed under the constant, watchful eye of my mother, and the menacing shadow of my brother. School became my only escape, the one place where I could be something other than the family scapegoat. I poured all of my energy into my studies, finding a strange, clean comfort in the logic of science and the certainty of mathematics. I was a ghost in the hallways, a quiet, serious girl who ate lunch alone in the library, but my grades were flawless. My teachers saw a diligent, if socially awkward student. They praised my work ethic and my intelligence, and for a few hours each day, their validation was a small precious shield against the poison at home. My academic success, however, was a source of irritation for my family. It disrupted their narrative. It was difficult to paint me as a complete failure when I was at the top of my class. Tyler, who was a mediocre student at best, resented it deeply. "She's just a bookworm," he'd sneer. "She has no life." My mother, instead of being proud, was suspicious. "I hope you're not cheating, Margaret," she'd say. Her eyes narrowed. "It doesn't seem possible for you to be that smart." They could not allow me to have anything that was truly mine, anything that they could not control or diminish. The injustice of it was a constant, slow-burning fire in my gut. I had done nothing wrong, and yet I was being punished every single day. I had been the victim of a crime, and I was being treated like the criminal. I learned to build walls around my heart, so high and so thick
that nothing could get in. I did not cry, I did not complain, I did not show any emotion at all. I became a master of the blank face, the placid expression, the quiet compliance. It was a mask I wore to survive, but I was terrified that one day, the mask would become my face, that the ghost I was pretending to be, would be all that was left of me.
The day I left for college was the first day of my life. I had earned a full academic scholarship to a small university in Chicago, a city blessedly, gloriously far from Houston. The scholarship was my ticket out, my declaration of independence, and my family treated it with a mixture of suspicion and relief. Tyler was furious. My success was a direct affront to his own mediocrity. He couldn't understand how the quiet, broken girl he had tormented for years had managed to achieve something he never could. He accused me of cheating on my entrance exams, a lie my mother was all too willing to entertain. Nancy's reaction was more complex. On the one hand, she was relieved to be rid of me, the constant, silent accusation that her presence represented. On the other hand, my departure disrupted the delicate balance of our toxic family. Who would do the dishes now? Who would be the target for her free-floating rage and disappointment? On the day I left, my father, who had been a phantom presence throughout my entire ordeal, drove me to the airport. We sat in a strained, uncomfortable silence for most of the ride. As I was getting out of the car, he turned to me, his eyes filled with a sad, weak pity. "You be good, Margaret," was all he said. He had been a ghost in his own home, a man so terrified of his wife's temper and his son's monstrousness that he had chosen to see nothing, to say nothing. His silence was not as loud as my mother's, but it was a betrayal nonetheless. College was a revelation. It was a world of noise, of laughter, of ideas, of people who saw me not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be known. For the first time in my life, I breathed air that was not thick with unspoken secrets and simmering resentment. I was terrified. I didn't know how to make friends. I didn't know how to have a normal conversation. The social skills that other people had learned naturally were a foreign language to me. I spent the first few months eating my meals alone in my dorm room, hiding in the library, a ghost in a new and overwhelming world. But slowly, tentatively, I began to emerge. I made one friend, a girl in my literature class named Monica. She was loud and funny, and completely unimpressed by my quietness. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. She saw strength. "You're like one of those deep-sea creatures," she told me once, "all quiet and still on the surface, but underneath, you're surviving under immense pressure." She was the first person I ever told, not everything, not at first, just fragments, that my home life was difficult, that my brother and I didn't get along, that my mother was complicated. Monica listened without judgment, and her friendship became my lifeline. I excelled in my studies. The university was a meritocracy, a place where my intelligence and hard work were rewarded. I majored in finance, drawn to the clean, cold logic of numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Spreadsheets didn't have mood. There was a safety in the certainty of a balanced ledger that I had never known in my own home. My relationship with my family during those years was a strained, hollow thing. I would call home once a week, a duty I performed with a heavy heart. The conversations were always the same. My mother would complain about her life, about the weather, about the price of groceries. She would then give me a detailed, glowing report of Tyler's latest achievements: a promotion at his dead-end job, a new car he had bought on credit, a girlfriend she approved of. There was never a question about my life, my studies, my friends. My existence was an afterthought. When I graduated with honors, they did not come to the ceremony. "It's too far to travel," my mother had said on the phone, her voice flat. "And Tyler has a very important golf tournament that weekend." I stood on the graduation stage, my diploma in my hand, and I searched the crowd for a familiar face, even though I knew there would be none. And in that moment, I realized that I was truly, finally on my. The last tie had been cut. I was an orphan, not by death, but by choice theirs. After graduation, I built a life for myself in Chicago, a life that was as far removed from my Houston past as I could make it. I got a job at a small investment firm, and I was good at it. The same meticulous attention to detail that had made me a top student made me a brilliant analyst. I found a quiet, sun-filled apartment in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets. I had my own space, my own key, my own silence, and it was a peaceful, healing silence, not the menacing quiet of my childhood home. I had Monica, who had also stayed in Chicago, and a small, carefully curated circle of friends. I was, for the first time in my life, content. My contact with my family dwindled to a few perfunctory phone calls on holidays and birthdays. They never visited. I never invited them. They were a part of a past I was trying to outrun. But the past has a way of catching up with you. My father passed away from a heart attack 5 years after I graduated. I flew back to Houston for the funeral, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. He had been a weak man, a silent accomplice to my abuse, but he was still my father, and his death left a complicated, empty space in my life. The funeral was a surreal performance. My mother played the part of the grieving widow to perfection, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Tyler stood beside her, a stoic, supportive son, accepting condolences with a grave expression. No one spoke of the ugliness that had defined our family for decades. We were all actors in a play for the benefit of the community. After the funeral, my mother, in a rare moment of vulnerability, asked me to stay for a while. "The house is so empty now," she'd said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how I'll manage on my own." A part of me, the foolish, hopeful part that refused to die, felt a flicker of sympathy. Maybe this was a chance for a new beginning. Maybe with my father gone, my mother and I could finally find a way to connect. It was a mistake. My extended stay quickly turned into a regression. The old dynamics snapped back into place with a terrifying speed. My mother's grief quickly curdled into her familiar pattern of criticism and Tyler, who had married his ambitious girlfriend Nancy, began to spend more and more time at the house, his presence a constant, low-grade source of anxiety for me. Nancy was a younger, sharper version of my mother, a woman who valued appearances above all else. She looked at me with a thinly veiled disdain, her eyes cataloging my simple clothes, my lack of expensive jewelry. I was an anomaly in the world of success and status she was trying to build with my brother. The final straw came when my mother fell and broke her hip. The recovery was long and difficult, and I became her full-time caregiver. I cooked, I cleaned, I managed her medications, I drove her to her doctor's appointment. I did it all without complaint, hoping that my service, my sacrifice, would somehow earn me the love and acceptance I had craved my entire life. But it didn't. One afternoon, as I was helping her with her physical therapy exercises, she looked at me, her face a mask of frustration. "You're not doing it right, Margaret," she snapped. "You're hurting me." Tyler, who had just walked in, immediately sided with her. "For God's sake, Mom, be more careful," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you can't handle this, we'll have to hire a professional." And in that moment, I saw it all, with a blinding clarity. Nothing had changed. Nothing would ever change. I was still the scapegoat, the source of all their problems. My love was not a gift. It was a service they felt entitled to, and a service they would always find wanting. "I raised you better than this." The words formed in my mind, a bitter, silent rebuke, but I knew better than to say them out loud. They wouldn't have heard them anyway. That night, I made a decision. I had tried to heal the past. I had tried to build a bridge, but the foundation was rotten. It was time to stop building and start demolishing. My decision to fight back was not a sudden explosive event. It was a slow, quiet hardening of the heart. I had spent a lifetime absorbing their cruelty, my silence a shield against their constant emotional assault. But after my mother's fall and their subsequent treatment of me, I realized that my silence was not protecting me. It was enabling them. It was time to change the rules of the game. My first move was a strategic retreat. I told my mother and Tyler that my firm in Chicago needed me back for an urgent project. It was a lie, but a necessary one. I packed a small bag and flew back to my quiet, peaceful apartment, leaving them to manage on their own. The frantic, angry phone calls started within a week. "Mom, the nurse we hired is too expensive," Tyler complained. "The house is a mess. When are you coming back?" "I'm not," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You'll have to figure it out." The silence on the other end of the line was deeply satisfying. For the first time, I was not the one reacting to their chaos. I was the one creating it. My next call was to Monica. I told her everything: the years of silent suffering, the caregiving, their unwavering entitlement. "It's time, Monica," I said. "It's time to settle my father's estate, and I want to do it my way." Monica, ever my loyal ally, put me in touch with a sharp, no-nonsense estate lawyer in Houston. Her name was Ms. Albright, and she was a revelation. I flew back to Houston and met with her in secret. I laid out the whole sordid history of my family, not as a victim, but as a client, seeking a very specific outcome. The will my father had left was simple. He had left the house and all of his assets jointly to my mother and me. However, he had also years ago signed a durable power of attorney over to me, a fact my mother had conveniently forgotten, and Tyler had never known. This document, dusty and forgotten in a safe deposit box, was my key. It gave me the legal authority to act on behalf of the estate. Miss Albright's eyes lit up when I showed it to her. "Margaret," she said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "They have no idea what's about to hit them." Our plan was audacious and beautiful in its elegant simplicity. We would not engage in a messy, protracted legal battle with my mother and brother. We would simply liquidate the primary asset of the estate, the house. As a legal agent of the estate, I had the right to force a sale. My mother, as a co-owner, would be legally obligated to comply. We hired a discreet real estate agent and put the house on the market as a pocket listing, avoiding a public for sale sign on the lawn. The agent presented himself to my mother and Tyler as an appraiser from the bank, sent to evaluate the property for insurance purposes. They, completely oblivious, let him in. They proudly showed him the upgrades they had made: the soulless gray walls, the uncomfortable Italian leather sofa. They were unwittingly giving a sales tour of the kingdom they were about to lose. The offer came in from a young family who loved the house's solid bones and large yard. They made a full cash offer, and the closing was scheduled in 30 days. 30 days until my mother and my brother would receive a formal, legal notice that the house they were living in no longer belonged to them. They had spent my entire life telling me what my place was. I was about to show them theirs. On the street. The 30 days leading up to the closing were a tense, surreal waiting game. I communicated with my family only through brief, non-committal text messages, pleading the demands of my project in Chicago. They were furious, their messages a barrage of guilt trips and angry demands. "Mom, the therapist says you need to come home and help with her recovery." "Margaret, this is selfish. Your mother needs you." I ignored them. Their needs were no longer my problem. My only focus was the quiet ticking clock of our legal timeline. On the day of the closing, I flew back to Houston. I sat in Miss Albright's office, my heart a steady, calm drum against my ribs. I signed the documents with a hand that did not shake. The house, the physical and emotional center of my life's pain, was sold. My half of the proceeds was wired directly into my new, secure bank account. My mother's half was placed in a trust, managed by an impartial third party, to be used for her future medical care, a final, ironic act of the caregiving they had so callously demanded of me. Now, all that was left was the final devastating act of our quiet, legal We had arranged for a sheriff's deputy to serve the official notice to vacate. We timed it for a Tuesday afternoon, the day my mother had her weekly bridge game at a neighbor's house. We wanted Tyler to be the one to receive the news. Alone, I sat in my rental car, parked at the end of the street, my heart pounding. I watched as the deputy's car pulled into the driveway. I watched as he walked to the front door and knocked. I saw the door open and Tyler's silhouette appear. I saw the deputy hand him the thick legal envelope. I saw Tyler's posture change,
from arrogant confidence to stunned disbelief. I saw him stumble back into the house and slam the door. It was done. The ripple effect was immediate and spectacular. Tyler called me, his voice a raw, ragged shriek of pure panic. "Mom, what did you do?" "A cop was just here. He gave me some kind of eviction notice. He said the house is sold." "This is a joke, right?" I let the silence stretch for a moment before I spoke, my voice as calm and cool as the surface of a deep lake. "It's not a joke, Tyler. It's a real estate transaction. The estate has been settled. The house is sold. You have 30 days to vacate the property." "You can't do this," he yelled, his voice cracking. "This is our home. Mom lives here." "No, dear," I said, my voice quiet, but laced with steel. "She lived there, and I lived there. And you treated us both like we were nothing more than an inconvenience. The new owners will be taking possession next month. I suggest you start packing." You planned this," he whispered, the dawning horror in his voice. "The sweetest music I had ever heard." "I raised you better than this," I said softly, using my mother's own favorite weapon against him. "But I guess the lesson never took." "Goodbye, Tyler." I hung up the phone. The boy I had protected, the brother who had tormented me, the man who had stood by while I was dismissed and devalued, he was finally truly on his own. The matriarch they had tried to bury had just signed the death certificate of their comfortable, stolen lot. I sit on the balcony of my Chicago apartment now, a cup of coffee warming my hands, and I watch the sun rise over the city. The air is cool and clean, and the quiet is a comforting blanket, not a suffocating shroud. My life is my own, curated, not by my mother's expectations or my brother's cruelty, but by my own sense of peace. The aftermath of the sale was as messy and as satisfying as I had imagined. My mother, upon returning from her bridge game to find her world upended, had a full-blown hysterical fit. Tyler, stripped of the financial and domestic support system he had taken for granted, his entire life, was completely lost. They were forced to move into a small, rundown apartment, their designer furniture and minimalist art looking absurd and out of place in the cramped, dingy room. Their marriage, a union based on a shared ambition for a life they didn't want to work for, began to crumble under the weight of their spectacular failure. They divorced within the year. My mother, now truly alone and with her finances managed by an impartial trustee, was forced to live a life of modest means, a stark contrast to the comfortable existence she had always taken for granted. My brother, Tyler, without my mother to champion him and my father's estate to plunder, floundered. His career stalled. He was just another mediocre man, stripped of the unearned privilege that had defined his entire life. I have not spoken to either of them since that final explosive phone call. A few months ago, I received a letter, forwarded from Miss Albright. The handwriting was my mother's, a shaky, spidery scrawl. It was a long, rambling letter, filled not with apology, but with a litany of her own hardships. Her life was so difficult, she was so lonely. It ended with a single stunning sentence: "After everything, I think you owe it to me to come home and take care of me." I read the letter, and then I did something the old Margaret would never have done. I laughed, a real deep, genuine laugh. The sheer unmitigated gall of it was almost impressive. I took the letter, walked over to the paper shredder Miss Albright had given me as a closing gift, and I fed it into the machine. I watched as her words, her entitlement, her complete lack of self-awareness, were turned into a meaningless confetti of paper. My help, my love, my service, they were no longer hers to command. I had found new places to invest my heart. I used a significant portion of my inheritance to establish a foundation in my father's name. The Frank Davis Foundation provides grants and legal aid to the families of abuse survivors, helping them navigate the complex and often brutal legal system. My family's darkest secret has become my life's most meaningful work. My story is not one of revenge. Not really. It is a story of reclamation. It is the story of a woman who was told she was a liar and remembered that the truth was her greatest weapon. It is a story about the quiet, unshakable power that comes from knowing your own worth, even when those closest to you have spent a lifetime trying to convince you that you have none. I am not a victim. I am a survivor. And as I watch the morning light spill across my apartment, I am filled with a profound and lasting peace. They told me to stop lying and do the dishes. I did, and then I made sure they were the ones who had to clean up the mess for the rest of their lives.